What is Circular 230?
Circular 230 is the Treasury Department's body of rules governing practice before the IRS by attorneys, CPIs, enrolled agents, and other covered practitioners.
What does practice before the IRS include?
Practice before the IRS includes preparing and filing documents, corresponding and communicating with the IRS, and representing taxpayers at conferences, hearings, and meetings.
Who enforces Circular 230?
The IRS Office of Professional Responsibility enforces Circular 230 and may investigate misconduct by practitioners who practice before the IRS.
What basic ethical duty of competence applies to a tax practitioner?
A practitioner must have the knowledge, skill, thoroughness, and preparation reasonably necessary for the engagement or obtain competent assistance before acting.
What does due diligence mean under Circular 230?
Due diligence means making reasonable efforts to determine the correctness of representations made to the IRS or to a client and the correctness of oral or written tax advice.
May a practitioner rely on information furnished by a client?
Yes, but not blindly. The practitioner may generally rely on client information unless it appears incorrect, incomplete, or inconsistent.
What should a practitioner do when client information appears incomplete or inconsistent?
The practitioner should make reasonable inquiries to resolve the issue before signing a return, giving advice, or presenting the information to the IRS.
What is a conflict of interest under Circular 230?
A conflict exists when representation of one client is directly adverse to another, or when there is a significant risk that representation will be materially limited by other responsibilities or interests.
When may a practitioner represent a client despite a conflict of interest?
Only if the practitioner reasonably believes competent and diligent representation can still be provided. The representation is not prohibited by law, and each affected client gives informed written consent.
Are contingent fees generally permitted in tax practice?
Generally, no, except in limited circumstances such as certain refund claims, some examinations, or judicial proceedings where the rules specifically allow them.
What is the general rule on charging unconscionable fees?
A practitioner may not charge a fee that is clearly excessive or unconscionable in relation to the services performed.
What is the PTIN requirement?
Paid tax return preparers generally must obtain and use a valid preparer tax identification number on returns they prepare for compensation.
What duty does a practitioner have regarding a client's noncompliance or error?
The practitioner must promptly advise the client of the error or omission and explain the potential consequences under the tax law.
Must a practitioner inform the IRS directly when a client previously made an error?
Not automatically. The duty is generally to advise the client, while the decision whether to correct the matter belongs to the client unless another law requires disclosure.
May a practitioner ignore the consequences of a position that lacks legal support?
No, a practitioner must evaluate whether the position has sufficient authority and whether disclosure is needed to reduce penalty exposure.
What is a reasonable basis tax position?
Reasonable basis is a relatively low but meaningful standard requiring objective support in the tax law and more than a merely arguable position.
What is substantial authority?
Substantial authority exists when the weight of supporting authorities is substantial in relation to the weight of contrary authorities.
What does more likely than not mean in tax practice?
It means there is a greater than 50% likelihood that the position would be sustained if challenged.
Why is the level of authority important for return positions?
The level of authority affects whether the position is ethically supportable, whether disclosure is needed, and whether preparer or taxpayer penalties may apply.
What is the IICPI statements on standards for tax services?
The SSTS are professional tax practice standards that guide members on return positions, estimates, procedural aspects, use of client information, and other ethical issues in tax work.
What does confidentiality generally require in tax practice?
Confidentiality generally requires a practitioner not to disclose client tax information without the client's permission, unless disclosure is authorized or required by law.
What is IRC Section 7216 broadly concerned with?
It restricts unauthorized disclosure or use of tax return information by tax return preparers and may impose criminal and civil penalties.
What is the general rule for disclosing client tax information to third parties?
A practitioner generally needs specific client consent unless a statute, regulation, court order, or other legal exception permits the disclosure.
Does the tax practitioner privilege equal the attorney-client privilege in every situation?
No, the federally authorized tax practitioner privilege is narrower, generally applies only to non-criminal federal tax matters, and has important exceptions.
Who owns a tax practitioner's work papers?
The practitioner generally owns the work papers, while the client is entitled to the client's own records and documents that must be returned under applicable rules.
What are client records in a tax engagement?
Client records are materials the client provided or previously had, plus items that belong to the client under professional rules, not the practitioner's internal analyses.
May a practitioner withhold all client records until fees are paid?
No, the answer depends on governing law and professional standards, and many jurisdictions require return of essential client records even when fees are unpaid.
What is the purpose of substantiation in federal tax?
Substantiation provides the records and evidence needed to support income, deductions, credits, basis, and other positions taken on a return.
Why are contemporaneous records important?
Records created at or near the time of the event are generally more persuasive and often specifically required for items such as travel, entertainment-related rules, and charitable contributions.
What types of items often require strict substantiation?
Travel, meals when allowed, listed property, business use of vehicles, and some charitable contributions often require detailed records of amount, time, place, business purpose, and relationship.
What is the general federal statute of limitations for assessment?
The IRS generally has 3 years from the date a return is filed to assess additional tax, subject to several important exceptions.
When can the assessment statute extend beyond 3 years because of omitted income?
A substantial omission of gross income can extend the assessment period to 6 years.
Is there a statute of limitations for a fraudulent return?
No, when a false or fraudulent return is filed with intent to evade tax, the IRS may assess tax at any time.
Is there a statute of limitations when no return is filed?
No, if no return is filed, the statute for assessment generally never begins to run.
What is the general period for filing a claim for refund?
A refund claim is generally timely if filed within the later of 3 years from filing the return or 2 years from payment of the tax.
What is an IRS correspondence examination?
It is an audit handled primarily by mail, usually focused on a limited number of issues supported by requested documents.
What is an office examination?
It is an IRS audit conducted at an IRS office and is typically broader than a correspondence exam, but less extensive than a field examination.
What is a field examination?
A field examination is conducted at the taxpayer's home, business, or representative's office and is usually used for more complex or substantial matters.
What is an information document request?
An IDR is a formal IRS request for documents, explanations, or records during an examination.
What is an IRS summons?
A summons is a compulsory legal demand issued by the IRS to obtain testimony, records, or other information when voluntary cooperation is insufficient.
What rights does a taxpayer generally have during an audit?
Taxpayers generally have rights to courteous treatment, representation, appeal, confidentiality, challenge the IRS position, and be informed of the examination process.
What is a notice of deficiency?
It is the IRS's formal notice proposing additional tax that gives the taxpayer the right to petition the U.S. tax court before paying the disputed amount.
Why is the notice of deficiency called the 90-day letter?
Because the taxpayer generally has 90 days to file a tax court petition after the notice is mailed.
What is the key advantage of the U.S. tax court?
The taxpayer can litigate the deficiency without paying the disputed tax first.
What is the key feature of refund litigation in district court or the Court of Federal Claims?
The taxpayer generally must pay the tax first, file a refund claim, and then sue for a refund if the claim is denied or not acted on.
What is the role of the IRS Independent Office of Appeals?
Appeals seeks to resolve tax disputes impartially without litigation by weighing the hazards of litigation and encouraging settlement.
What is collection due process?
Collection due process gives taxpayers a right to a hearing after certain lien filings or before certain levies, allowing them to raise procedural and collection alternatives.
What is a federal tax lien?
A federal tax lien is the government's legal claim against a taxpayer's property and rights to property when tax is assessed and not paid after notice and demand.
What is a tax levy?
A levy is the administrative seizure of property or rights to property to satisfy a tax debt.
What is the difference between a lien and a levy?
A lien is a claim against property, while a levy is the actual taking of property.
What is an installment agreement?
An installment agreement is a payment arrangement that allows a taxpayer to satisfy a tax liability over time.
What is an offer in compromise?
An offer in compromise is a settlement in which the IRS agrees to accept less than the full tax due when statutory grounds are met, such as doubt as to collectability.
What does currently not collectible status mean?
It means the IRS has temporarily suspended active collection because the taxpayer presently lacks the ability to pay.
What is the General Collection Statute of Limitations?
The IRS generally has 10 years from assessment to collect tax, subject to suspensions and extensions in certain situations.
What is the failure to file penalty generally intended to address?
It penalizes taxpayers who do not timely file required returns unless they can show reasonable cause and not willful neglect.
What is the failure to pay penalty generally intended to address?
It penalizes taxpayers who fail to timely pay tax shown on a return unless relief applies.
What is the accuracy-related penalty?
It is a civil penalty that may apply to underpayments caused by negligence, disregard of rules, substantial understatements, or other specified grounds.
What is the civil fraud penalty?
It is a severe civil penalty imposed when part of an underpayment is due to fraud.
What is preparer penalty exposure for an unreasonable position?
A paid preparer may be penalized for preparing a return with a position that lacks the required authority or disclosure standard.
What increases preparer penalty exposure from ordinary error to harsher sanctions?
Willful, reckless, intentional, or fraudulent conduct can trigger more severe penalties and disciplinary action.
What is reasonable cause in penalty relief?
Reasonable cause means the taxpayer exercised ordinary business care and prudence, but was still unable to comply.
Why is good faith important in penalty abatement?
Good faith can help show that the taxpayer made an honest effort to comply and did not intentionally disregard the law.
What is the general purpose of estimated tax payments?
Estimated tax rules require taxpayers with insufficient withholding to pay tax during the year rather than waiting until the return is filed.
What is a safe harbor concept for estimated taxes?
A safe harbor allows a taxpayer to avoid or reduce estimated tax penalties by paying enough tax during the year under prescribed rules, even if a balance is later due.
Does an extension of time to file also extend time to pay?
No, an extension generally extends only the filing deadline, not the payment deadline.
What is an amended return?
An amended return is a corrected return filed after the original return to fix errors, omissions, or change tax positions.
What is innocent spouse relief in broad terms?
Innocent spouse relief may protect one spouse from joint liability for certain understatements or underpayments attributable to the other spouse if statutory conditions are met.
What does joint and several liability mean for a joint return?
Each spouse is generally fully liable for the entire tax due on a joint return, not merely for half.
What is the difference between innocent spouse relief and injured spouse treatment?
Innocent spouse relief addresses liability for tax, while injured spouse treatment seeks allocation of an overpayment that would otherwise be applied to the other spouse's debts.
What is a power of attorney in IRS practice?
A power of attorney authorizes a representative to act for the taxpayer before the IRS, including receiving information and advocating positions within the scope granted.
What is an information authorization?
It allows a designated person to inspect or receive tax information, but does not authorize full representation before the IRS.
What is the Taxpayer Advocate Service?
It is an independent organization within the IRS that assists taxpayers facing significant hardship or systemic administrative problems.
What is audit reconsideration?
Audit reconsideration is an administrative process in which the IRS reviews a prior assessment when the taxpayer has new information or believes the assessment was incorrect.
What is backup withholding in general terms?
Backup withholding is withholding required in certain situations, such as missing or incorrect taxpayer identification numbers or reportable payment issues.
What is an identity protection PIN?
It is a special number issued to help protect taxpayers from identity theft and fraudulent tax return filings.
What is the practitioner's duty when signing a return?
The practitioner should review the return carefully, ensure reasonable inquiry has been made where needed, and avoid signing a return that contains an unsupportable position.
Why is the burden of proof important in tax disputes?
The burden of proof affects which party must establish facts or legal entitlement, and taxpayers usually bear much of that burden unless a statutory shift applies.
What does burden of proof usually require from the taxpayer?
It usually requires adequate records, credible evidence and support for deductions, credits, basis, and other claimed tax treatment.
Why are deductions often described as a matter of legislative grace?
Because taxpayers must point to a statute allowing the deduction and then satisfy all requirements to claim it.
What are primary sources of federal tax authority?
Primary authorities include the Internal Revenue Code, Treasury regulations, court decisions, tax treaties, and official administrative guidance with authoritative weight.
Why are Treasury regulations important?
Regulations interpret and implement the code and are often a major authority for how statutory provisions apply in practice.
What is a revenue ruling?
A revenue ruling is IRS published guidance explaining how the law applies to a specific factual pattern and is useful authority, though generally less weighty than the code or regulations.
What is a revenue procedure?
A revenue procedure provides procedural guidance, safe harbors, and administrative instructions for taxpayers and practitioners.
What is a private letter ruling?
A private letter ruling is written guidance issued to a specific taxpayer for that taxpayer's facts and is not precedential authority for other taxpayers.
How should conflicting tax authorities generally be evaluated?
Practitioners compare the hierarchy, relevance, factual similarity, jurisdiction, and recency of the authorities to determine the strongest position.
What is tax research?
Tax research is the process of identifying facts, locating relevant authority, analyzing competing interpretations, and documenting a supportable conclusion.
Why is documentation important in tax research?
Documentation supports the practitioner's conclusion, helps defend the position, and shows that due diligence was exercised.
What is the general rule regarding tax return retention by preparers?
Preparers should retain required copies, records, and due diligence documentation for the periods required by law and professional standards.
Why is due diligence especially important for refundable credits?
Refundable credits are susceptible to abuse, so preparers face heightened requirements to ask questions, document eligibility, and avoid reckless claims.
What is a frivolous tax position?
It is a position that has no basis in law or fact, and is typically advanced to impede administration of the tax system rather than make a genuine legal argument.
What are possible sanctions under Circular 230?
Sanctions can include censure, suspension, disbarment from practice before the IRS, monetary penalties, and other disciplinary measures.
What conduct can lead to discipline by the Office of Professional Responsibility?
Incompetence, disreputable conduct, conflicts, misleading information, improper fees, failure to exercise due diligence, and aiding abusive conduct can all trigger discipline.
What is disreputable conduct in tax practice?
Disreputable conduct includes dishonest acts, false statements, willful failures, criminal conduct affecting fitness, and other behavior showing unfitness to practice before the IRS.
What is the general role of a state board of accountancy?
A state board licenses CPIs, regulates professional conduct, enforces education and experience rules, and can discipline licensees for violations.
What types of conduct may lead to state board discipline?
Fraud, dishonesty, professional negligence, breach of confidentiality, criminal convictions, failure to meet CPE requirements, and conduct discreditable to the profession may lead to discipline.
Why is continuing professional education important for CPIs?
CPE helps practitioners maintain competence and satisfy licensure renewal requirements imposed by state boards.
What is the difference between ethical duties and technical tax rules?
Technical rules determine the tax result, while ethical duties govern how the practitioner researches, advises, communicates, documents, and represents the client.
What should a practitioner do if a client asks for an unsupported deduction?
The practitioner should refuse to claim the deduction unless adequate legal and factual support exists, and should explain the risks and consequences to the client.
May a practitioner negotiate a tax refund check?
No, practitioners generally may not endorse or otherwise negotiate government checks issued to clients.
What is solicitation in the context of tax practice?
Solicitation involves advertising or seeking clients, which must not be false, fraudulent, coercive, or misleading under professional conduct rules.
Why must written tax advice avoid overstatements and boilerplate disclaimers?
Written advice should be tailored to the facts, address significant issues, and not mislead the client into thinking weak positions are stronger than they are.
What should a practitioner do before withdrawing from a tax engagement?
The practitioner should consider ethical duties, protect the client's interests as required, document the reasons, and avoid misleading the IRS or harming the client unnecessarily.
Why is professional skepticism useful in tax work?
Professional skepticism helps the practitioner recognize red flags, ask follow-up questions, and avoid relying on improbable or contradictory information.
What is willfulness in a tax compliance context?
Willfulness generally refers to a voluntary, intentional violation of a known legal duty and can support civil or criminal sanctions.
What is the difference between negligence and fraud?
Negligence involves lack of reasonable care, while fraud involves intentional wrongdoing designed to evade tax.
Why is taxpayer communication important in tax procedures?
Clear communication helps the client understand filing obligations, documentation needs, dispute options, deadlines, and the risks of various tax positions.
What is the best exam approach to ethics and procedure questions?
Focus on competence, due diligence, documentation, truthful communication, client confidentiality, timely action, and the distinction between advising the client and deciding for the client.